Welcome to our sixth video in our series, Reading the Bible as a Story, the story of Abram, in which we're exploring Genesis 12 to 25. When we last left Abram, he demonstrated faith by believing God's promise that he would have offspring from his body like the stars in the sky. And God credited this faith to him as righteousness. At the same time, Abram needed reassurance that the promise of land to his offspring would be realized. And so God entered into a covenant with Abraham to give him this reassurance. In Genesis 16, Abram's faith is tested again, and he yields to fear instead of holding on to faith. And so in this our sixth video, we're going to be exploring Hagar and Ishmael, Abram's story in Genesis chapter 16. In Genesis 16:1, we read, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, 'Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her.' And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai." So in Genesis 16:1, right after God promises Abraham a son and descendants from his body in Genesis 15, we're told in Genesis 16 that Abram's wife had borne him no children. The biblical writer is highlighting for us this tension in the story whereby Abraham, who is supposed to have all this progeny, is married to a woman who is barren. Now, since God didn't say that Abraham's descendants were to come from Sarai's body, but from Abram's, Sarai could think that finding a surrogate mother was an acceptable compromise. And Sarai so happens to have acquired a slave from Egypt named Hagar. And Hagar, that name in Hebrew, essentially means the foreigner or the immigrant. Now, this recalls God's foretelling Abram that his descendants would be foreigners in a land not their own. So in verse 2, Sarai says to Abram that Yahweh, the Lord, has kept me from having children. She's saying that God is holding out on her, like Eve was deceived by the snake into thinking that God was holding out on her by telling her that she could not eat from the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Since God is not delivering, Sarai most likely thinks, let's take things into our own hands. Go sleep with my slave, and perhaps I can build a family through her. Now, Abram listened to her, or to Sarai, is parallel to Adam listening to Eve. And God saying to him in Genesis 3 that he would suffer consequences because he listened to his wife instead of obeying God's word. The language is quite similar to Genesis 3, and so we are put on notice immediately that there is a potential danger lurking here in the wings. Now, notice also that nobody says to Hagar, "What do you think?" No one, neither Abram nor Sarai, asked Hagar her opinion about what is to be done with her body. And throughout the narrative, neither Abram nor Sarai call Hagar by her name. Both of them only refer to her as Sarai's servant. This, I think, indicates that they are objectifying and dehumanizing Hagar and using her to fulfill their own purposes. In Genesis 16 verse 3, we read, "So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress." The text tells us that it's been 10 years without the promise of a child being fulfilled. And with every passing year, it seems more impossible and unlikely that this promise that God had given Abraham that he would have a son from out his body and multiple offspring is going to be realized. Now Sarai took Hagar and gave her to Abraham to be, this translation says, his wife. Really, to be a second wife, a second order wife, a concubine. And like Eve took the fruit and gave it to her husband Adam and he ate, Sarai took Hagar and gave her to Abraham and he slept. Hagar conceives, demonstrating that the problem was not with Abraham in terms of conception, but with Sarai. And so Hagar's status in the household is improved by her bearing Abraham's child, whereas Sarai could not. And she begins to look down on Sarai. And so Sarai's plan misfires badly. She miscalculates. And what she thought was going to bring her a solution to her problem creates an even greater problem. And so we read that in verse 5, and Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked down on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. So Sarai responds to the misfiring of her plan by blaming Abram for the wrong that she is suffering. And really, right here, she is being a little hypocritical, because that word translated as wrong in verse 5 in the ESV is the Hebrew word Hamas, which means violence. And it's the same word that is used in Genesis 6 when God decides to bring the flood because there is violence or Hamas on the earth. And this word describes injustice and exploitation of men against each other, which led God to bring the flood as judgment. And so the word describes properly what both Abram and Sarai did to Hagar. But Sarai cannot see the violence that she and Abraham do to Hagar because she's so focused on how the plan is misfired against her. And as I said, Abraham nor Sarah do not call Hagar by her name, a name they likely gave to her as this Egyptian slave that they got and brought into the land of Canaan. And only the narrator thus far calls her by her name Hagar. As I've said, Hagar is being objectified and dehumanized by Abraham and Sarah as a means of satisfying their means. She's a means to an end. But Abraham shifts the responsibility back to Sarai. He says, "Your servant is in your power to do as you please." Now, all this blame shifting between Abraham and his wife Sarah reminds us of Genesis 3, when God confronts the man and the woman in the garden, and they pass the buck from each other and eventually down to the snake as a means of not facing up with the wrong that they have done. Abram says to Sarai, "Do what is good in your eyes." And so Sarai mistreats Hagar. We're not told what she does to her, but Hagar flees. One of the things I think we have to realize as well is that, in a sense, Hagar has produced some of this due to her response to her mistress. God had said to Abraham that anyone who dishonored him, God would curse. And in a sense, by dishonoring her master, Hagar has sown some seed, which has resulted in this friction in the household. She's not responsible for putting herself in the position that she's in by them taking her as a surrogate mother, but she has compounded the situation and made it worse by the disrespect that she has shown to Sarai. Now, what Sarai proposed was actually a culturally accepted practice in the society in which she lived. There are in fact several ancient Near Eastern texts which demonstrate a marriage practice whereby an infertile wife would procure her maidservant as a concubine for her husband to serve as a surrogate wife and bear children on the infertile wife's behalf. Gordon Wenham, for instance, writes, "It was a serious matter for a man to be childless in the ancient world, for it left him without an heir. But it was even more calamitous for a woman. To have a great brood of children was the mark of a success as a wife. To have none was ignominious, failure." So throughout the ancient Near East, polygamy was resorted to as a means of obviating childlessness. But wealthier wives preferred the practice of surrogate motherhood, whereby they allow their husbands to go into their maids, a euphemism for sexual intercourse. The mistress could then feel that her maid's child was her own, and exert some control over it in a way that she could not if her husband simply took a second wife. So whilst this is a culturally acceptable and a proper and a respectable course of action given the social mores of the ancient Near East, it is clear that the author of Genesis does not approve of Sarah's action. Firstly, I say this because Sarah's proposal is self-reliant versus God-reliant. Her proposal seems to be the normal human response to the problem of childlessness in the ancient world, whereas the promise of a real heir in Genesis 15:4 suggests something abnormal would take place. Secondly, the way in which Sarai takes initiative to solve a problem instead of waiting for the Lord's intervention reminds us of Abram's approach in Genesis 12 when he goes down to Egypt, and in a difficult situation, he calls Sarai his sister. He's being self-reliant. Thirdly, close attention to the wording of Genesis 16 verses 2 to 3 suggests the narrator's disapproval because it clearly alludes to Genesis 3. This suggests that Genesis 16 narrates a fall as occurred in Genesis chapter 3. Now there are images or motifs from the garden scene in which we find a repetition of them in Genesis 12. But as is usually the case in Hebrew narrative in the Bible, these are repeated with some variation and not with exact correspondence. Recall our discussion early in the series about how parallelism works in Hebrew poetry to give us a greater depth of perception by seeing slight differences in comparison, like the slightly different angles our two eyes have on an object, which give us a greater visual perception. In a similar way, there are some slight variations in Hagar's story in Genesis 6 from the story of the fall in Genesis 3, which these variations are intended to give us a deeper perception and understanding of what is taking place when we compare it to Genesis 3. So some of the similarities that have been slightly changed include the fact that there is no snake in the foreground. The snake is missing, but I think the snake is in the background insofar as this thought that Sarai has that God is holding out on her is similar to the thought that Eve had that God is holding out on her. And of course, it was the snake who introduced that thinking into Eve's thought. And I think we can surmise that the snake is at work and is introducing this kind of thinking into Sarai's mind. The tree with fruit in Genesis 16 is Hagar. And this is so because, as I've said earlier, that human beings are metaphorically depicted as trees in the biblical story insofar as they have seed and they produce fruit. In the story, Adam and Eve are represented by Abram and Sarai. And the garden is Canaan, this new promised land that God is creating where he can interact with man and there can be intersection of heaven and earth insofar as it's a space that God will dwell with man. So by means of these parallel repetitions from the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Abraham's and Sarah's failure with Hagar is being compared to the fall in Genesis 3. Not only is the language similar, but the actions of the characters are also similar. So in Genesis 16, we have Sarah playing the role of Eve and Abraham the role of Adam. Sarah has her own Garden of Eden moment somewhere in the land, which is the new Garden of Eden. Even more than the repetition of lead words, it is the pattern that is being repeated here. For instance, Sarah wants to fix her family problem of having no children, and so she does what seems right in her own eyes because, like Eve, she thinks God is holding out on her. She says, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. She proposes that Abraham sleeps with her maidservant as an option or solution. And Abraham, like Adam, acquiesces. The text literally reads, Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah, which is similar to Genesis 3:17, where God says to Adam, because you listened to your wife. Now Sarah takes her Egyptian servant Hagar and gives her to Abraham for him to sleep with in the hope that she can build a family through her servant. And this is similar to Eve taking the fruit and giving it to Adam, her husband. And there is in fact an identical sequence of key nouns and verses in Genesis 3:6, where we read there that the woman took and gave it to her husband. Abraham, like Adam, says okay and takes what is offered to him. And so the actors in Genesis 3 correspond with the actors in Genesis 16. In 16:3, the woman takes initiative as she does in 3:6. And the recipient of the gift in both texts is the man. In Genesis 16:3, it's Abram the husband. In Genesis 3, it's Adam the man for whom the woman was created as a partner. In both stories, the man reacts appropriately to the woman's actions. In Genesis 3, he eats the proffered fruit. In Genesis 16:4, he goes into the offered Hagar. The means of sin, the fruit or Hagar, is accepted by the man, and the sequence of events is similar in both cases. The woman takes something and gives it to her husband, who accepts it. Now, Hagar doesn't conceive, she does conceive, forgive me, and afterwards she despises Sarah when she saw she was pregnant. And this is equivalent to the eyes of Adam and Eve being open to see that they were naked. It's not what they were expecting, and a disappointing result that leads to chaos. In a similar way, what Hagar sees is not what her master and her mistress anticipated, in that she sees really that Sarah is barren. And it leads to disappointing result for Sarah and to chaos in the family. Then there's a blame shifting, like in Genesis 3. Abram responds to Sarah's, may the wrong done to me be on you, by saying, your servant is in your hand, do with her as you wish. And that is, I think, comparable to Eve seeing the forbidden fruit as good in her eyes, because when Abram says, your servant is in your power to do with her what is good in your eyes, literally, tov, this is similar to Eve doing what is good in her eyes. Sarah, in fact, does what is good in her eyes, and she mistreats Hagar. And Hagar flees from Sarai, which is corresponding to Genesis 3:8, where Adam and Eve hide from God. So Abram and Sarah fail too, by doing what is right in their eyes, instead of fearing God, and by putting themselves in the center of their world, by trying to take control and to order their world, producing disappointing results and unleashing chaos, disorder in their family life, and ultimately into the wider world. So we're back to the pattern from Genesis 3. Sarah sees what is good in her eyes, being that she would take her maidservant Hagar and she would have her lay with her husband Abraham, which is contrary to God's will, because God's will expressed in Genesis 1 is one man, one wife for life. And rather than this producing a child that Sarah and Abram can call their own, there's a disappointment because Hagar seeks to displace her mistress, and this leads to chaos in their family life. So for the second time around, Abraham and Sarah fail the test like Adam and Eve did in the garden. And their action results in Hagar fleeing like Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden. Well, what happens next in the story is that the angel in Genesis 16 verse 7, on the next slide we read that the angel of the Lord found her, Hagar, by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said to Hagar, "Servant of Sarah, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai." So Hagar is on her way back to Egypt when she's found by the angel of the Lord. And the angel of the Lord is a mysterious figure that appears from time to time in the biblical story. And this figure essentially is a theophany, that is an audible or visible manifestation of God. It is essentially God himself appearing in human form so that he can interact with humans. And God manifests, therefore, as the angel of the Lord personally and goes in search of and finds Hagar. He went looking for her himself. And when he finds her, he calls her by her name. And he asks, "Where have you come from? And where are you going?" This is like God looking for Adam and Eve after they went into hiding in the garden. And he asks them, "Where are you?" His question was not for them. He knew where they were. And similarly, God knows entirely what has happened with Hagar and Abraham and Sarah, but he is asking for her sake. And for the first time, Hagar is called by her name by a person in the story. Abraham and Sarah may have objectified and dehumanized her, but God sees her and interacts with her as she is truly a person. In verse 8, the angel of the Lord asks Hagar, "Where are you coming from and where are you going?" Like God asks Adam, "Where are you?" in Genesis 3:9, and he asks Cain, "Where is Abel?" in Genesis 4:9. The questions are really for her, as were the questions to Adam and Eve in the garden and to Cain. And Hagar says, "I'm running away from my mistress." God tells her to go back and submit and promises to bless her with numerous descendants. We read that the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." God promises to take care of Hagar like he promised to take care of Abraham by multiplying her offspring. The implication is that even in the hostile environment of Sarah's home, God will see to it that her child is not harmed, with the result that multitudes will come from Hagar. She's wandering in the desert, a pregnant woman being alienated from the father of her child. In a patriarchal society, she's vulnerable. God says, "Go back to Abram's household where you and your child can be provided for and taken care of despite Sarah's hostility." And God says, "I promise I'll take care of the child, and in the end, it will be well." In verse 11, we read that the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." So we have now the first indication that the child that Hagar is carrying is a boy, and that Hagar will in fact give birth to a son. Abram is going to have a son through her. The child, God says, is to be named Ishmael. And that name means God hears. And God says, you're to name him Ishmael because Yahweh, the Lord, when you see Lord in all caps in most English translations, that is for the holy four letters Yod, He, Vav, He, or YHWH in the actual Hebrew text. And so he says to her, the child's been named Ishmael because Yahweh has heard her misery. She's been complaining, and God has heard her, like he heard Abel's blood calling out from the earth. And as he would hear the outcry from Sodom in Genesis 19, and he would hear the Israelite cry for deliverance from Egyptian oppression in the Exodus. So in the midst of this mess created by Abraham and Sarah, God graciously takes care of and provides for Hagar. And this reminds us of how God, in the midst of Adam and Eve's sin, covered them with animal skin. And whilst he does this act of grace, at the same time, in Genesis 3, he declared the consequences that would follow, which includes, in Hagar's case, the fact that Ishmael will live in hostility with all his brothers, which is in keeping with Genesis 3:15, where we're told that there will be hostility between the seed of the snake and the seed of the woman. And it's also in keeping with this repeated motif of sibling rivalry, as in Cain and Abel and other stories, for example, Jacob and Esau. Well, in verse 13, we read that she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Be'er La'ai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar names Yahweh, and she is one of the only characters in the Bible to give a name to God. She names Yahweh who spoke to her, and she names him the God who sees me. Because when others didn't, God sees Hagar. He sees Hagar when Abraham and Sarah stopped seeing her as a person and exploited her and treated her harshly and unfairly. God was compassionate towards her and intervened to address the mess that Abraham and Sarah had created. And I think this tells us something about who God is. He sees the oppressed. He sees the marginalized. He sees the widow, the orphan, the foreigner. And it also tells us something about our need. In the midst of whatever it is that we're going on, it's important to each of us to be seen and for someone to understand our situation and the injustice that we face. And this passage tells us that God sees us. Even when we don't see him, God sees us as he saw Hagar and took care of her needs. We're told that Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So Hagar bears Abram Ishmael at 86 years old. So 11 years have passed since this promise to come into the land, and Abram has come into the land of Canaan. And the son was to be Sarai's. This was Sarah's plan for the child that Hagar gave birth to be considered her son that Abraham has with Hagar as a surrogate. But 3 times in a couple of verses we are told that Hagar bore Abraham a son. Abraham calls the son Ishmael, and I think this is because Hagar would have conveyed to him her encounter with Yahweh in the wilderness. And by naming Ishmael, Abraham accepts him as a son in his household. And so Hagar's burden of a son for Abraham makes clear to all that Sarai's barrenness has been the cause of Abraham not previously having a son. And although Sarah's scheme to produce a son succeeded, she's shut out from enjoying its success. She's on the outside looking in. and her slave girl has been elevated in the household at her expense and in spite of her mistreatment of her. How must Sarai be feeling right about now? Well, what brought about this mess? What brought Abraham and Sarah to this place? I think it's their fear that God's promises would not be fulfilled. It was their fear of not being able to fulfill their dreams and have significance by fulfilling what they perceive to be their purpose in this world and by leaving a legacy through having a son. Similarly, I think we each have to think, what choices face us today that tempt us to act out of fear, which can lead to a similar disaster? I look forward to your joining us next time as we explore Genesis 17.